She was never supposed to be there. Every powerful crime family in Chicago packed that ballroom. Silk suits, blood money, and smiles sharp enough to cut glass. And in the middle of it all, her own sister grabbed the microphone and told 500 of the most dangerous people in the world that Nia Bradford was nothing. Too big, too dark, too invisible to matter. Then the most feared man in Chicago crossed that entire room, past every gorgeous, polished, perfect woman, and stopped right in front of her. If you've ever been underestimated, stay with me. Like this video, drop your city in the comments and let's see how far this story travels. The dress was wrong. Nia knew it the moment she put it on. Not wrong in the way her mother used to mean. Wrong cut, wrong color, wrong size. Always wrong size, but wrong in a deeper, more honest way. It was the kind of dress you wore when you were trying to disappear inside a crowd while pretending you weren't. Navy blue. Structured. Professional. The fabric strained slightly at the hips, and she told herself that morning, standing in front of a mirror that had never once been kind to her, that it didn't matter. That tonight wasn't about her anyway. It never was. The Syndicate Centennial Gala was held every year at the Marquette Grand Ballroom, a place so old and heavy with history that even the chandeliers seemed to be watching you. Chicago's underworld showed up dressed like the city's finest, and in a way they were. Politicians owed them favors. Judges knew their names. The police commissioner had shaken hands with every boss in that room at least twice, in private, where cameras couldn't reach. This was the world Nia Bradford had grown up inside without ever fully belonging to it. She arrived 20 minutes early because that's what she always did. Not out of eagerness, out of necessity. Early meant she could find a corner, orient herself, understand the layout before the sharks started circling. She moved through the side entrance with Marcus, her father's head of security, a man built like a refrigerator with the conversational warmth of one, and he led her to the Bradford family's reserved section near the east wall without saying a single word to her the entire drive over. That was fine. She'd stopped expecting words a long time ago. The Bradford table was already half filled when she arrived. Her father, Gerald Bradford, sat at the head, broad-shouldered, silver-haired, with the kind of face that had once been handsome and now just looked expensive. He wore a charcoal suit that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent, and he was already deep in conversation with a man Nia didn't recognize. He glanced up when she sat down, looked through her, looked back at his conversation. She poured herself a glass of water. 20 minutes later, Camille arrived. Her half-sister made an entrance the way some people breathed, automatically, effortlessly, as if the air itself rearranged around her. She was 23 and looked like a different species than Nia, which made a kind of cruel sense because they had different mothers. Camille's mother had been a runway model from Atlanta. Nia's mother had been a church secretary from the South Side, who worked 2 jobs and died of a stress-related heart attack when Nia was 19. The math was visible on both of them. Camille wore red. Of course she wore red. She laughed at something someone said before she even reached the table, and the laugh traveled ahead of her like a herald announcing royalty. Every head turned. Gerald Bradford's face opened up in a way it never did for Nia. Something close to pride, maybe even love, the warm version that she'd watched him give away to everyone except her. "Baby girl," he said, standing. Camille kissed his cheek, sat down across from Nia, glanced at her with the particular brand of pity that's actually just contempt in a nicer coat. "You're wearing that?" she said quietly, not mean enough for anyone else to hear, just enough for Nia to feel the edge of it. "Yes," Nia said. "Okay." Camille turned away and reached for the champagne. Nia's jaw tightened. She reached into her small clutch and pulled out her phone, opened the encrypted financial app that only she had the password for, and checked 3 accounts without looking like she was doing anything at all. That was another skill she'd developed over years, working invisibly. The Bradford family's fortune lived inside her head the way other people carried car keys. She knew every account number, every offshore routing code, every shell company name, every false identity attached to every LLC that her father had ever let her build. And he had let her build all of them because she was brilliant at it, and because brilliant could be used without being celebrated. The dinner service began. The room filled. The noise built to that particular frequency of money and power colliding. Hundreds of conversations happening simultaneously, everyone performing a version of themselves that was slightly better than the truth. Nia ate her salad and watched the room the way she always watched rooms, cataloging faces, noting who sat with whom, what those proximity choices meant. She spotted the Moretti family at the far table. Francesco Moretti, 71, holding court with his two sons and a handful of men she didn't recognize. The Morettis controlled the West Side docks. They moved product through the Port Authority with enough efficiency to make a logistics company jealous. She'd seen their financial footprint once, 2 years ago, when her father had briefly considered a partnership. The numbers had been sloppy. Amateur-level money laundering. She'd told her father as much and he'd nodded and then proceeded to ask Camille what she thought, as if Camille had ever seen a balance sheet in her life. Camille had said the Morettis seemed sketch, and Gerald Bradford had said, my thoughts exactly. And that had been that. Nia had gone home and poured herself 2 fingers of bourbon and stared at the ceiling until she felt less like screaming. The speeches started around 8:30. The gala's host, a man named Whitfield, who ran legitimate catering as a front and illegitimate arms brokering as a career, welcomed everyone with the kind of hollow sincerity that passed for charm in rooms like this. He talked about the legacy of Chicago's business community. He talked about partnerships and loyalty and the future. He made 3 jokes, all of them landed, and Nia noticed that every laugh in the room was half a second behind the punchline. The delay of people who weren't sure if laughing was safe until they saw the boss laugh first. She was watching the Moretti table when Camille leaned over. "Don't stare," her sister said. "You look desperate." "I'm not staring." "You're doing that thing you do where you think nobody notices you noticing things." Camille sipped her champagne. "It's weird. It makes people uncomfortable." "Nobody's looking at me, Camille." "Exactly." She said it without cruelty, which was somehow worse, like a fact, like weather. That's kind of my point. Nia set down her fork. Her appetite had been gone for 20 minutes anyway. The thing about Camille was that she wasn't entirely wrong, and Nia had spent enough hours alone in the dark being honest with herself to know that. She moved through rooms like furniture. She'd learned to do it on purpose. Stay small, stay quiet, let the work speak. But the work never actually got to speak, did it? It sat in encrypted files on servers in the Cayman Islands and Luxembourg and a small bank in Malta that had no internet presence and did exactly 12 transactions a year. It kept the Bradford family alive and untouchable, and Gerald Bradford never once said her name in a room this full of people. She was reaching for her water glass when the doors at the far end of the ballroom opened. The shift in the room was subtle but real, the way a temperature drops by 2 degrees before a storm. Conversations didn't stop exactly, but they quieted, recalibrated. Nia looked up. Dominic Viscari walked in like a man who had decided in advance that nothing in this room could threaten him. He was 38, and that age sat on him the way it sits on certain men. Earned, not given. Not classically handsome. Too sharp for that. His jaw had been broken once and hadn't healed entirely straight. His nose had been broken twice. The suit was immaculate, but it didn't soften him the way suits were supposed to. He moved with 3 men flanking him at measured distances, close enough to act, far enough not to crowd, and Nia recognized the choreography immediately. Those men were bodyguards so good at their job that they'd eliminated all the tells. The Viscaris had run Chicago's North Side for 40 years. Dominic's father, Roberto Viscari, had built the empire. Roberto had also died 14 months ago of a stroke at his kitchen table, the most mundane death imaginable for the most feared man in the city. And Dominic had stepped into the role with a silence that made people more nervous than shouting would have. He hadn't restructured everything immediately. He'd watched. He'd waited. He'd let people show him who they were before deciding what to do about it. That's what the street said anyway. Nia had read a different story in the numbers. She'd run a routine cross-analysis of the Viscari syndicate's publicly visible financial signals 3 months ago. Not because anyone had asked her to, but because she did that kind of thing the way other people read novels. What she'd found had kept her awake for 2 nights. The Viscari organization was not in transition. It was in transformation. Money that had been moving through predictable channels for decades was being quietly rerouted through instruments so sophisticated that most federal analysts would miss it entirely. Someone inside that organization understood high-level international finance at a level that made Nia's own work look almost conservative. She'd closed the file and told herself it wasn't her problem. She was still thinking about those numbers when Dominic Vescari sat down at the table directly across the room from hers and looked up, and for half a second, just half, his eyes landed on her. She looked away first. Dinner resumed, more speeches. The Whitfield man said something about the next century of Chicago's legacy, and everyone applauded with the correct amount of enthusiasm. Gerald Bradford was on his third bourbon and starting to look expansive, the way he got when he was performing Confidence for an audience. He shook hands with Francesco Moretti during the cocktail break, laughed too loud. Nia watched her father's body language and read the subtext. He was nervous about something. Gerald Bradford was never nervous unless money was threatened. She filed that away. The band started playing around 9:15. It was the kind of band that played at events like this. Technically excellent, utterly inoffensive, background music dressed up in tuxedos. The dance floor opened and couples moved onto it with varying degrees of willingness and ability, and Camille was immediately pulled out there by some young man whose suit alone announced his family's tax bracket. Nia stayed at the table. She had her phone out again, running preliminary numbers on a subsidiary she'd flagged 3 weeks ago for potential federal attention. The work steadied her. It always had. When everything else felt out of her control, her body, her family, the particular loneliness of being the most capable person in a room that refused to see her. The numbers were honest. They told the truth. They didn't care what she looked like. "Why is she always on her phone?" someone said nearby. She didn't look up. "Gerald's embarrassed by her, you can tell. Have you noticed he never introduces her?" "What's to introduce?" Low laughter. Female voices, somewhere to her left. She kept her eyes on the screen and her breathing even. This part was not new. This was just Tuesday, elevated by formal wear. Then Camille came back from the dance floor flushed and bright-eyed and reaching for her champagne, and she looked at Nia with something shifting in her expression, the alcohol loosening whatever filter she normally maintained. And she said, loud enough that the people at the neighboring tables could hear, "You know what your problem is? You actually think working hard is enough." Nia looked up from her phone. "Camille, I'm serious." Her sister wasn't being cruel. That was the problem. She seemed to genuinely believe she was offering something useful. "This is a room full of powerful men, Nia, important men, and not a single one of them has looked at you tonight. You know why? Because this is how the world works. They want something to look at, and I'm not saying it's right. I'm just saying it's true, and I don't know why you keep showing up to these things and acting like, Camille, stop. Like working hard in some back office is going to make anyone choose you. No man in this room is going to walk past every other woman here to get to you. That's just reality. And it's not about being mean, it's about, that's enough." Nia's voice came out flat, not broken. She'd had 19 years of practice keeping her voice from breaking. "You've made your point. I'm just being honest with you because nobody else will be. You're being honest in front of 40 people because you've had 4 glasses of champagne and you want an audience." The table had gone quiet. The neighboring tables had gone quieter. Nia could feel the attention like heat on her skin. She pushed her chair back and stood and kept her spine straight the way her mother had taught her. Because her mother had known this world and had known what it did to you if you let it fold you. And she turned toward the exit. The room was watching. She walked through it anyway. She made it 11 steps before the music shifted. She counted. Later, she always counted. And the sound of the crowd changed in a way she couldn't immediately identify, but felt in the base of her spine. She stopped. She wasn't sure why. Behind her, she heard the whispers start. She turned. Dominic Vescari was walking across the ballroom floor, not toward the bar, not toward a cluster of associates, not toward Camille, who stood frozen with her champagne glass halfway raised, or toward the half-dozen other women in that room who had spent the evening positioning themselves in his peripheral vision. He was walking toward her. He walked like a man with no doubt about his destination, and the crowd parted for him in that unconscious animal way crowds part for certain people. And the band kept playing, but it seemed farther away somehow, and Nia stood completely still because her body had made a unilateral decision to stop functioning while her brain tried to process what was happening. He stopped in front of her, close enough to be intentional, far enough to be respectful. He was taller than she'd expected. His eyes were very dark, very still, and they were focused entirely on her face with an attention so complete it felt almost like an accusation. He held out his hand. "I'd like the next dance," he said. "If you're willing." His voice was low, not performative. He wasn't saying it for the room, he was saying it to her. The entire underworld of Chicago was holding its breath. Nia Bradford stood in the middle of the ballroom, 11 steps from the exit, with the most dangerous man in the city's hand extended toward her, and she thought about the exit, and she thought about her mother, and she thought about 19 years of being invisible in rooms full of people who should have known better. And she thought about the fact that she was still shaking slightly from what her sister had said, and trying not to let it show. She looked at his hand. She looked at his face. She thought, this changes something. I don't know what yet, but this changes something, and she took his hand. The crowd released its breath. The whispers erupted like a dam breaking. Somewhere behind her, she heard her father's voice say something, and she heard Camille make a sound that wasn't quite a word. And she heard the music swell back into focus as Dominic Viscari led her onto the dance floor, and the entire room watched, and she thought, very clearly, that she had made a choice tonight whose consequences she could not yet calculate. And she was almost always able to calculate consequences. That alone should have frightened her. What frightened her more was that somewhere under the fear, under the exhaustion and the ache of the evening, and the still fresh sting of her sister's words, something was burning. Small, but real. She hadn't felt that in a long time. She didn't know yet that within 48 hours, she would be inside the Viscari estate with access to financial records that would change everything she thought she understood about power in this city. She didn't know that the man currently leading her through a slow, careful dance had been watching her for months. She didn't know that the money disappearing from the Viscari counts, the trail she hadn't followed because she'd told herself it wasn't her problem, was going to become her problem in a way that threatened both their lives. She didn't know any of that. She only knew that his hand was steady, and the room was watching, and she was still standing. For tonight, that was enough. But tomorrow was already coming. The drive to the Viscari estate took 40 minutes. Nia had not planned to go. That was the truth she kept turning over in the back of the car. She had not planned any of this, and she was a woman who planned everything, who had contingencies for her contingencies, who had once built a 3-year financial exit strategy for a shell company on a napkin during a turbulent flight because her hands needed something to do. She did not do spontaneous. She did not do impulsive. She did not get into black SUVs at 11:15 at night with men she'd spoken a total of 40 words to. And yet here she was. The city slid past the tinted windows in streaks of amber and neon. Dominic sat beside her with the particular stillness of a man who had learned that silence was a form of pressure. He wasn't performing calm. He was calm, or something close enough to it that the difference didn't matter. His hands rested on his knees. He hadn't touched her since the dance floor, hadn't tried to close the distance between them on the seat, hadn't said anything that required an answer. She hated that she noticed all of that. It meant she was already paying the wrong kind of attention. "You're doing math in your head," he said. She looked at him. "What?" "Your lips move, just slightly." He wasn't looking at her. He was watching the city. "Most people think, you calculate." She said nothing. "That's not a criticism," he said. "I know what it is," she said. "I'm deciding whether I trust it." He turned his head then, looked at her directly. "Smart." "I have my moments." The estate was north of the city, set back from a road that didn't appear on most navigation systems, and was lined with mature oaks that had been there longer than anyone in the car had been alive. The gate was iron and serious, and the security checkpoint was staffed by 2 men who wore their guns the way accountants wore ties. Professionally, without comment. The main house appeared around a curve in the driveway. A structure that was large without being ostentatious, built from gray limestone that had darkened with age, lit from below with the kind of careful lighting that said money without screaming it. Inside it smelled like old wood and something faintly chemical underneath. The industrial cleaning products of a place maintained to an obsessive standard. The ceilings were high. The hallways were wide. The art on the walls was real and mostly dark. Landscapes from periods when painters understood that the world wasn't a pleasant place and didn't pretend otherwise. A man was waiting in the entrance hall, late 50s, heavy through the middle, with a face that had arranged itself permanently around a frown. He wore a suit that had been expensive 5 years ago and hadn't been properly pressed since. His eyes moved to Nia and stayed there with an assessment so frank it was almost rude. "This is Vincent Caruso," Dominic said. "He runs operations." "Second in command," Caruso said, and there was something in the way he said it, flat, corrective, that added a word he didn't actually speak. "Mine." "Mr. Caruso," Nia said. "Miss Bradford." He said her name like he was identifying a piece of evidence. "I wasn't aware we were expecting guests." "You weren't," Dominic said, and moved past him toward the interior of the house. The conversation was over. Caruso's frown deepened by a fraction, and he turned and followed, and Nia walked slightly behind them both and watched the dynamic between the two men the way she watched balance sheets, looking for the places where the numbers didn't add up. They didn't add up almost immediately. Dominic led her to what he called the strategy room, which was a generous name for a space that looked more like a financial analyst's worst fever dream. 3 walls were given over to monitors showing data feeds, market indices, and what appeared to be custom analytics dashboards she'd never seen the architecture of before. 1 long table was covered in physical files, paper, which surprised her, and the overhead lighting was the harsh, honest kind that offices use when they want people to work rather than feel comfortable. "Sit wherever," Dominic said, pulling off his jacket and throwing it over a chair with the ease of a man returning to a familiar space. He loosened his tie, poured 2 glasses of water from a pitcher on the side table, handed her one. "You're wondering why you're here?" "I'm wondering several things," she said. "That's near the top. I've been investigating your family's finances for 8 months. He said it the way someone else might say, I've been watching the weather. Factual, unapologetic. Not your father's, yours." She set the water glass down. Her face didn't move. "My father's finances are—" Gerald Bradford hasn't understood his own accounts in 4 years. He pulled a file from the table and opened it. She recognized her own work in it, not the documents themselves, but the structure, the architecture, the particular way she built financial labyrinths. She recognized it the way you recognize your own handwriting. "This is yours. The Bradford Pacific LLC chain, the Luxembourg intermediaries, the Malta routing system." He set the file down and looked at her. "I had 12 analysts work on this for 6 months. Not one of them could fully map it. Then I hired a forensic accountant out of London who'd spent 8 years at Interpol. She got 60% of it before she told me she needed another year." He paused. "You built that in what, 18 months? The room was very quiet. Through the walls, distantly, Nia could hear the house settling into itself the way old buildings do. Wood contracting, pipes adjusting, the structural conversation of stone under load. 14 months, she said. Something moved in his expression. Not surprise. He'd already known it was impressive. This was confirmation. "Why haven't you left your father's operation and built your own?" Because nobody builds their own in this city without the infrastructure to protect it. She heard herself saying it and recognized the honesty of it, the specific bitterness of a true thing stated plainly. "I'm good with money. I'm not good with men who carry guns. You'd need someone who was. I'm aware. That's why you're here." She looked at him for a long moment. The monitors hummed. Somewhere in the house, a door opened and closed. "What exactly are you offering?" she said. "Chief financial strategist. Full authority over the syndicate's financial architecture. A salary that would make your current arrangement look like an allowance." He sat down across from her, elbows on the table, and his posture said this was the real meeting. The dance had been the opening. This was the substance. "In exchange, I need someone who can do what you do. Find what's hidden. Build what can't be found. You have your own financial people." "I have accountants," he said. "I don't have you." She held his gaze. This was the part where most people would have been flattered enough to say yes too fast, and she registered the flattery and filed it separately from the decision, the way she always separated emotion from calculation. "I'd need to see your books," she said. "I know. All of them. I know. And if I find something you don't want found?" He didn't hesitate. "That's why I'm asking you specifically." It took her 3 days to find it. She moved her primary workstation to the estate on the second day. Dominic had offered her use of the strategy room during hours she set herself, with access to every server in the Viscari financial network and a dedicated secure line she could use to reach her own offshore accounts if she needed reference material. It was the most complete financial access she'd ever been given. It was also, she recognized clearly, a test. Not of loyalty, not yet, but of capability. And she had never in her life failed a test of capability. She worked the way she always worked, methodically, without music, with the lights turned slightly too bright because comfort made her sloppy. She ate at the desk. She slept 4 hours a night on the cot that had appeared in the adjacent room without her asking, because someone in this household paid attention to things. She did not think about the gala. She did not think about Camille's voice carrying over the ambient noise of 500 people. She worked. On the morning of the third day, she found the first thread. It was small, a discrepancy in a quarterly disbursement cycle for a subsidiary called Vesco Logistics Partners, a genuine shipping company used as a layering vehicle, standard practice, nothing remarkable, except the disbursement totals didn't match the intake records by a margin of $230,000. Spread over 8 quarters. Adjusted for normal variance, it should have been invisible. For most analysts, it would have been. Nia pulled the thread. Behind the logistics subsidiary was a holding entity called Greymark Capital. Behind Greymark was a personal trust with no corporate connection to the Vescari family, registered in Delaware under a name she didn't recognize, Thomas Paul Wren. She ran the name through every database she had access to and came up empty. Then she cross-referenced the trust's registered agent with a tax filing from 3 years prior and found that the same agent had registered 2 other entities, one in Wyoming, one in Nevada, both of which appeared as counterparties in a series of wire transfers that had moved over 14 months, exactly $11.4 million through a web of accounts that ultimately terminated in a bank in the Cayman Islands. She sat back in her chair. The Cayman account's routing signature matched a financial pattern she had seen once before, not in the Viscari books, but in a file she'd built years ago when mapping rival family structures. She had to go back through her encrypted archive to be certain. It took 2 hours and she was certain. Thomas Paul Wren didn't exist. But the money went to the Moretti family. She sat with that knowledge for 4 hours before she said anything to anyone. Not because she was afraid exactly, but because she understood what the discovery meant structurally, and she needed to be sure she understood the full shape of it before she handed it to anyone. A leak of this size, running this long, with this level of sophistication, it wasn't accidental. It wasn't even freelance theft. This was built. Someone inside the Vescari organization had taken months to construct a financial bypass system, precise enough that it had survived 8 months of Dominic's internal review. Someone who understood finance at a level that was rare. Someone with enough access to touch core accounting systems. She pulled the access logs for the server she'd been working on, cross-referenced the login timestamps against the organizational chart Dominic had given her, cross-referenced that against the disbursement authorization chain. Every thread led back to the same signature, the same authorization code, the same senior-level credentials used to approve each redirected disbursement without triggering internal audit flags. Vincent Caruso. She printed nothing. She saved nothing to any local drive. She held it in her head, all of it, the account numbers, the routing chains, the dollar figures, the 14-month timeline, the way she held everything important, because paper could be found and digital files could be accessed by the wrong people, and her memory was the only truly secure storage she'd ever had. Then she went to find Dominic. She found him in the East Wing, in a room that turned out to be a private gym, working a heavy bag with the focused aggression of someone processing something they hadn't decided how to handle. He was in a gray t-shirt and his knuckles were wrapped. He was hitting the bag hard enough that the chain holding it shook with each impact. He didn't stop when she came in. He'd heard her. She knew he'd heard her, because a man with his history developed a physical awareness of space and entry points that didn't turn off, but he kept hitting. She said, "I found something." He hit the bag twice more. Stopped. His breathing was elevated but controlled. He grabbed a towel from the bench. How bad? 11.4 million over 14 months, moving to a Cayman terminus that connects to a Moretti-affiliated chain. He was very still. The kind of still that isn't calm. "You're sure?" he said. "Yes." "Who?" She told him. The silence that followed was the loudest she had ever been inside. Dominic stood with the towel in his hands and his chest rising and falling in a slow and deliberate rhythm, and his face had gone through something. She watched it happen, some rapid internal reorganization, like a building in the moment before it decides whether to stand or fall. And then it settled into an expression she hadn't seen on him before. It was colder than anger. It was the face of a man who had already begun calculating consequences. "Caruso's been with my family for 22 years, he said. Not to her, almost to himself. "I know. I read the history. He was there when my father died." A pause. "He helped me through the transition." "I know that too." He looked at her. "How certain are you?" She held his gaze and said what she always said when her work was at stake. "I don't bring someone something like this unless I've checked it 3 times. I've checked it 6. He nodded once, dropped the towel, picked up his phone, made a call in under 30 seconds that she wasn't meant to hear, and she turned slightly away to give him the performance of privacy, even though the room was not big and she heard every word. He told whoever answered to locate Caruso's current position. He told them to keep distance. He told them not to engage. He hung up, looked at her. "Stay in the estate." "Dominic, I'm not negotiating that." His voice had changed. Not louder, harder. "You stay here. You don't communicate with anyone outside this building until I'm back. You understand what I'm telling you?" She understood exactly what he was telling her. He was telling her that if Caruso knew she'd found this, she was already a target. He was telling her that the moment she'd handed him that information, she'd stepped across a line she couldn't step back over. He was telling her, in the compressed and violent language of this world she'd always circled but never fully entered, that she was no longer an outside consultant. She was inside it now. "I understand," she said. He held her gaze for 3 full seconds, and she had the specific sensation of being seen, not assessed, not evaluated for usefulness, but actually seen, the way almost no one in her life had ever bothered. And then he moved toward the door. "Dominic." She said it before she'd made the conscious decision to speak. He stopped. "The money isn't just leaking to the Morettis." She hadn't told him this part yet. She'd been holding it, turning it over, because it was the part that changed the shape of everything. The transaction architecture, the way it's built, it's not just payment, it's coordination. Someone is paying them to be ready for something specific. The payment schedule accelerates in the last 3 months. She paused. Something is already in motion. He looked at her. His jaw was tight. His eyes were doing something she couldn't fully read. "How soon?" he said. "Based on the acceleration pattern?" She did the calculation one more time in her head, not because she wasn't sure, but because the answer was the kind of answer you check twice before you say aloud. "Days, maybe less." He stood in the doorway for a moment that felt longer than it was. Then he was gone. Nia stood in the empty gym listening to the echo of his footsteps on the stone floor until she couldn't hear them anymore. And then she stood there a while longer because moving felt like it would make everything that had just happened more real, and she needed another few seconds of the fiction that she still had a choice. She didn't have a choice. She hadn't had one since she pulled that first thread 3 days ago. She walked back to the strategy room and sat down in front of the monitors and began to do the only thing she knew how to do when everything around her was falling into a shape she didn't yet understand. She worked. She pulled every transaction record she hadn't already mapped. She traced every subsidiary connection she hadn't fully followed. She was 3 layers deeper into the Moretti payment chain when she found the access log timestamp she hadn't noticed before. Someone had accessed the Vescari financial servers 6 hours ago. Not from inside the estate. From a remote location, using credentials that had been revoked 8 months ago when Dominic had restructured the IT hierarchy during the transition. Someone who no longer officially had access had just looked at everything she'd been looking at. Her phone buzzed. An unknown number. She almost didn't answer. She answered. "Nia Bradford." The voice was female, smooth, familiar in a way she couldn't immediately place. "You've been very busy." And then she recognized it, and the blood in her body went somewhere else entirely, because the voice belonged to her sister, and Camille was not supposed to know this number, and Camille was not supposed to know where she was. And the only way Camille could know either of those things was if someone had told her, and the only people who knew were inside the Vescari estate, which meant Nia did not hang up. That was the first decision, and it happened below the level of conscious thought. Some cold, functional part of her brain that had learned years ago to keep operating when everything else wanted to shut down. She held the phone against her ear, and she breathed, slow and even, and she did not say anything for 4 full seconds while the rest of her caught up to what was happening. "You went quiet," Camille said. Still smooth. Something underneath the smoothness that Nia was already trying to classify. Not nervousness, not guilt. Something that had been arranged in advance. "That means I surprised you. You're never surprised. Where are you calling from? Does it matter?" "It matters a great deal." Nia's voice came out level. She was aware of this as a separate thing from feeling level, the way you're aware of your own heartbeat when something is wrong. "How do you have this number?" "Nia." A pause. The sound of Camille exhaling slowly, like someone who has been holding something heavy and has finally decided to put it down. "I need you to listen to me very carefully, and I need you to not do whatever you're thinking about doing right now." "I'm not thinking about anything." A lie. She was thinking about 7 things simultaneously, cataloging and discarding options with the same automated efficiency she applied to financial problems, except this problem had moving parts and a human variable she'd never correctly modeled. "Talk." "You're in danger." "I know I'm in danger. That's not information. That's a sentence." Nia was already moving. She'd stood without deciding to, her body making the spatial calculation that sitting still in a room with floor-to-ceiling monitors and one entrance was not acceptable. She moved toward the wall, put her back to stone, faced the door. "Tell me something I don't know." "Dominic isn't going to find Caruso," Camille said, "because Caruso is already gone. He left the estate 40 minutes ago with 3 men, and he's not coming back without—" A pause. Something in the background, a low voice, male, words she couldn't make out. Then Camille again, and this time the smoothness had cracked slightly, just at the edge, without finishing what he started. The monitors hummed. Somewhere in the house, distant and institutional, Nia heard a door close that should not have been closing, the specific sound of a door being secured from outside. "Camille." She kept her voice the same, level, low, the tone of a woman conducting a business call. "How long have you been in contact with Caruso?" Silence. "How long?" That's not what this call is about." "It's exactly what this call is about." She moved to the door, tried the handle, locked as she'd already known it would be. She looked at the door frame, solid core, steel reinforced, the kind of door that was built to keep things in as well as out. She turned back to the room and her eyes went to the monitors, the server rack, the secondary terminal in the corner. "You're going to tell me how deep you're in this, and you're going to tell me right now, because I'm going to figure it out regardless. And the difference is whether I figure it out while I can still do something useful with the information, or after it stops mattering." Another pause. Longer. When Camille spoke again, something had shifted in her voice. Not remorse, not yet, but the beginning of a reckoning with the arithmetic of what she'd done. 8 months, she said. "I've been talking to Caruso for 8 months. The number landed like cold water. 8 months was not impulsive. 8 months was not panic or opportunity, or a bad decision made in an emotional moment. 8 months was a choice made and remade every day for 240 days, while Camille sat across from Nia at family dinners and smiled and refilled her champagne and said the kinds of small, manageable cruelties that could always be explained away as honesty. "Okay," Nia said. "Nia," I said, "okay, keep talking." She was at the secondary terminal now, fingers moving across the keyboard before she'd fully consciously planned what she was doing, the muscle memory of the work taking over where the rest of her wanted to come apart. "What did Caruso tell you to do?" "He told me to call you, to keep you on the phone." The crack in Camille's voice had widened. "He said if I kept you on the line for 20 minutes, that was enough time for—" Nia hung up. She had been on the phone for 11 minutes. Her hands moved. The secondary terminal was connected to the same server network she'd been working in, with the same level of access she'd been granted 3 days ago, and she called up the estate's internal security system interface, not because she had authorization to access it, but because she'd noticed on day 1 that the security system ran through the same network backbone as the financial servers and shared an authentication architecture. And she'd cataloged that the same way she cataloged everything, not knowing when it would matter, knowing only that it might. It mattered now. She got through the authentication in 4 minutes. The internal camera feeds came up on 3 of the monitors. She moved through them fast, pulling each quadrant of the estate in sequence. The entrance hall, the corridors, the perimeter. The entrance hall had 2 men she hadn't seen before, not Dominic's regular security. Different build, different stance, different way of standing with their weight distributed that said military or ex-military, but not the disciplined kind, the kind that had gone private and stopped following rules. They were not moving toward the strategy room yet. They were waiting for something. The east perimeter feed showed a vehicle parked at the service entrance with its lights off. The north corridor feed showed Vincent Caruso walking with his hands in his pockets and the calm of a man who had already made every decision he needed to make. He was walking toward her. Nia stood in the strategy room with the locked door in front of her and the monitors behind her. And 9 minutes, at most, before Caruso reached her. And she thought about Dominic, where he'd gone, whether he'd been led somewhere specific, whether the confrontation he'd gone to have was itself the trap. And she thought about the money, 11.4 million and the acceleration pattern and the things she'd told him about something already being in motion. And she understood now with a clarity that was almost peaceful that she had not found the conspiracy in time to prevent it. She had found it in time to be inside it when it detonated. She pulled up the Viscari Financial Network Master interface and she started working. Not to escape, not yet, to make the only move she had. She began with the Moretti-connected accounts, the Cayman Terminus, the Delaware Trust, the Wyoming and Nevada entities. She accessed each one using the authentication credentials she'd mapped during her 3 days of analysis, the backdoor entry points she'd identified not to use but to understand, because understanding a system completely meant understanding how it failed. She began moving money, not stealing, restructuring, redirecting, pulling every available balance out of every account in the Moretti payment chain and routing it through a series of intermediate accounts she was building in real time. Each one a disposable entity that existed only long enough to receive and redirect, until the funds reached a terminus she created in 30 seconds flat, an encrypted digital vault with a 12-digit access code that she generated and memorized and did not write down anywhere. 3 minutes. She'd moved 4.2 million before she heard footsteps in the corridor outside. She kept working. The Vescari Syndicate's own operational accounts were next. Not all of them, not the ones that would cripple daily function, but the discretionary reserves, the emergency liquidity funds, the accounts that Caruso would need access to if he was planning to fund a transition of power. She froze them using a security protocol she'd built into the network's own architecture during her 3 days of access. A failsafe she'd installed not because she'd expected to need it, but because she built failsafes into every system she touched, because that was the fundamental discipline of her work. You never assumed the structure would hold. The door handle moved. She had locked it from the inside using the security system override, but the lock was magnetic, and a magnetic lock had a power source, and someone outside was doing something to the power source because the monitors flickered once and the magnetic lock made a small defeated sound and the door opened. Vincent Caruso stepped into the room. He looked at her. He looked at the monitors. He looked at what she'd been doing on the screens, read it fast, faster than she'd expected, which recalibrated something. And his expression went through a sequence she watched carefully. Recognition, assessment, and then something that was not anger, but was adjacent to it. The functional equivalent of anger in a man who had spent decades training himself not to show weakness. "Clever," he said. "Thank you." "Step away from the terminal." She didn't move. "The accounts you need are already locked. The Moretti money is already moved. You can have your men break every server in this room, and it won't help you, because none of what you need lives here anymore." She kept her voice the same temperature it had been on the phone with Camille. Professional. Conclusive. "You should factor that into whatever you're planning to do next." He walked into the room slowly, with the unhurried gait of a man who had already decided how this ended. He was heavier than he looked in his suit. Up close, his face had the particular texture of someone who had absorbed a great deal of violence over a long life and had given most of it back. He stopped 6 feet from her. "Where did you move it?" "Somewhere you can't reach." "There's nowhere I can't reach." "There is now." She held his gaze. Her hands were steady. She was proud of that later. Not in the moment, because in the moment she was too focused for pride. But later she remembered that her hands were steady. You've been running this for 8 months, and you've been very good at it. And I understand why you thought you could do this. Dominic is new. You know where everybody is buried. You have relationships and history, and the Morettis have resources. It was a reasonable calculation. She paused. You didn't calculate me. No, he said. I didn't. He didn't seem particularly troubled by this. That was an error. I'm correcting it. 2 of the men from the entrance hall appeared in the doorway behind him. Nia looked at them, then back at Caruso. She had run out of moves on the board. She understood this with the same clarity she brought to any analysis. Not denial, not bargaining, just the precise recognition of a position that had no good exits. She had protected the money. She had done everything the work allowed her to do. The rest of the situation was made of things she did not know how to fight. Dominic will come back, she said. Dominic walked into a meeting with Francesco Moretti 40 minutes ago. Caruso's voice was patient, almost kind, in the way of a man explaining something to someone who would have understood it earlier if they'd been paying attention to the right things. He went there because I told him we had a source inside the Moretti family who wanted to defect and would only speak to him directly. He's sitting in a room right now with 6 men who are not interested in defecting. He let that settle. By the time anyone finds him, this transition will be complete and the organization will have already moved forward. The silence that followed was the kind that has weight. She thought about Dominic in a room with 6 men. She thought about the way he'd looked at her in the gym, not assessing, seeing. And she thought about his hands steady on the heavy bag, and his voice when he said, I don't have accountants, I have you, and something moved in her chest that she did not have time to examine carefully. If you hurt him, she said, you will never see that money again. I will burn every account you need, every routing path, every access point. I will make it so that the money you move to the Morettis is the last money you ever touch. You understand me? Caruso looked at her for a long moment. That's a very brave thing to say, he said. From where you're standing. He nodded to the 2 men behind him. They moved. She didn't run. There was nowhere to run to, and she'd known that before he walked through the door, and she'd made her choice. To use the time she had to do damage that mattered, and she'd done it. And now she held that knowledge while they took her phone and moved her away from the terminal, and she did not give them the satisfaction of struggling. She walked where they directed her, down the corridor she'd moved through twice a day for 3 days, past the room where she'd slept 4 hours a night, through a door at the end of the hall she'd assumed was a utility access. It was stairs, going down. The level below the strategy room was unfinished. Concrete walls, industrial lighting on pull-cord fixtures, the smell of earth and old damp, and the particular cold of spaces that are underground all year. It had the feel of a space that had been built for a specific purpose that predated the current occupants and their specific needs. She cataloged the dimensions automatically as they walked. 30 feet wide, longer than she could see clearly, no windows. They stopped at a section of wall that had been fitted with what she could only call a holding space, a reinforced alcove with a door of steel mesh floor to ceiling, the kind of space that was not improvised. It had been here a while. Caruso stopped behind her. The code to access the vault, he said. I'll ask twice. She looked at the mesh door. She looked at the concrete walls. She thought about 12 digits that existed only inside her head, and she thought about the fact that the thing keeping her alive right now was precisely that those 12 digits were only inside her head, and that Caruso was smart enough to know it. No, she said. That's the first time. He said it without anger. Business. I'll ask again in an hour. The conditions will be less comfortable. The door closed. The light on the pull cord was 3 feet above her head, and she could reach it, but there was nothing to see in the dark that she hadn't already seen in the light. So she left it on, and she sat down on the floor with her back against the concrete wall. And she ran the calculations. Dominic, in a room with 6 men and no warning. The Moretti meeting had been arranged by Caruso, which meant it was an ambush, and the quality of the ambush depended on what the Morettis had been told. Were they told to hold him or to finish him? The payment acceleration she'd found suggested the Morettis expected a significant structural change, a change that would require Dominic to be permanently out of the way. She closed her eyes. Open them. The fluorescent light buzzed at a frequency that had already started to feel like pressure. She had the vault code. She had $11.4 million and the Vescari emergency reserves in an encrypted space that only she could open. She had knowledge of the complete financial architecture of two crime families and the betrayal chain connecting them. She had, as Caruso understood, exactly one thing of value in this situation, and it was not her freedom. What she did not have was a way to reach Dominic, a way to warn anyone, a way out of a reinforced alcove in an underground room in an estate that had, as of 40 minutes ago, been taken over by men who worked for the person she'd trusted with the most dangerous information she'd ever held. She sat in the cold and she breathed and she did not panic. Panic was the enemy of calculation, and she was a person who calculated. She went through the estate layout in her head. Every room she'd walked through, every door, every structural detail she'd filed away without knowing why. She thought about the security system she'd accessed from the terminal upstairs, the camera feeds, the electromagnetic lock infrastructure. She thought about the network backbone and the financial server architecture and the particular way the building's systems all ran through a single integration point she'd identified on day 2 as an efficient design choice and a significant vulnerability. She thought about what she could do with 12 digits and an internet connection. She thought about what she could do without one. And then she heard it, above her, somewhere in the structure of the house, not close, a sound that the building transmitted through its bones the way old buildings do, a sound she couldn't immediately identify except that it was sudden, and it was not a door, and it was not a settling of wood. It happened again, and then twice more in quick succession. And in the cold underground room, Nia Bradford sat very still and understood that the sound was gunfire, and that someone had just made a choice that was going to define what happened next, and she had no way of knowing whose choice it was or what it meant. And for the first time in 3 days, she was doing something she almost never did. She was waiting for someone else to determine whether she survived. The light buzzed. The concrete was cold through the fabric of her dress. Somewhere above her, the house had gone very quiet, in the specific way that spaces go quiet after violence. Not peaceful, but hollowed out. The silence of a place where something has been decided, but the decision hasn't finished arriving yet. She pulled her knees to her chest. She waited. And then the footsteps started on the stairs. Not the measured, patient footsteps of Caruso, not the heavy, coordinated tread of the men he'd brought. These were faster, uneven, the footsteps of someone moving with urgency through a space they were navigating for the first time. And she got to her feet before she'd made the conscious decision to, her whole body orienting toward the sound the way a compass orients north. And the footsteps reached the bottom of the stairs and came toward her through the dark and stopped on the other side of the mesh door. She looked at the face on the other side, and every calculation she'd been running went quiet. Because it wasn't Dominic. It was her father. Gerald Bradford stood in his ruined charcoal suit with blood on his collar that wasn't his. She could tell because his hands were steady and his breathing was elevated but controlled. And he looked at her through the steel mesh with an expression she had never in 27 years seen on his face. Not in her direction, not for her. He looked like he was afraid of losing something. Nia. His voice was rough, stripped of the performance she'd heard in it every night of her life. We need to talk about what I know and what I should have told you a long time ago. The door between them was still locked and his hands were empty, and the house above them had gone quiet again, and she looked at her father's face and thought, there is a version of this that is rescue, and a version of this that is the next layer of the trap. And I do not yet know which one I am standing inside. Start talking, she said. Gerald Bradford was not a man who apologized. Nia had known this her entire life, the way she knew her own blood type. As a fact, clinical, without particular feeling attached to it. Her father operated in a world where apology was indistinguishable from weakness, and weakness got you killed. And over 40 years that philosophy had calcified into something that wasn't even a choice anymore, just the shape of the man. So when he stood on the other side of that mesh door with blood on his collar and his face stripped of its performance and something in his eyes that looked dangerously close to regret, she didn't trust it. She cataloged it. She filed it under variables requiring verification and kept her feet planted and her breathing even. The door, she said. Open it. I don't have the key. Then find something useful to do with your hands and keep talking. He ran one hand over his face. The gesture was old and tired, and she recognized it suddenly as something she'd seen him do in private. The rare moments she'd caught him unguarded, not the Gerald Bradford who sat at the head of tables and commanded rooms, but the man underneath that, who was apparently still in there somewhere, wearing her father's face like a suit that had never quite fit. Caruso called me 6 months ago, he said. He told me the Vescaris were planning to absorb the Bradford operation, that Dominic was going to make a move against us the moment the transition from his father settled. She processed this. And you believed him. He had documentation, financial records, movement patterns, communications intercepts. A pause. They looked real. They were real, she said. I built documentation like that for a living. So did whoever Caruso had working for him. She looked at her father's face. You made a deal. He said nothing, which was the same as yes. What did you give him? Access. The word came out flat, the way confessions come out when the person saying them has stopped trying to manage how they land. Bradford family accounts, the routing architecture for our offshore chain. He looked at the floor for half a second, then back at her. Your work. I gave him your work. The fluorescent light buzzed. Somewhere above them the house was silent in the specific way of held breath. You gave him my architecture, she said slowly. He needed it to move money without triggering federal flags. He said it was temporary. That once the Vescari threat was neutralized, there was no Vescari threat. She heard her own voice, and it was very quiet, which was the register she reached when she was past anger into something colder and more structural. Caruso manufactured it. He needed your accounts as additional laundering infrastructure for the Moretti payments. He needed access to my routing system because his own people couldn't build something clean enough at that volume. She let that sit between them. He played you. For 6 months he played you, and you gave him everything he needed to do this. Gerald Bradford absorbed this the way men absorb information that restructures their understanding of the last 6 months of their life. Not quickly, not gracefully, with the visible effort of something fundamental being dismantled and rebuilt. His jaw worked. His hands, at his sides, closed into fists and opened again. I thought I was protecting the family, he said. I know. And she did know, which was the complicated part. She knew the specific fear her father operated from. The fear of losing what he'd built. The fear of becoming irrelevant. The fear that without the empire he'd constructed from violence and calculation and 40 years of surviving things that killed other men, he was nothing. She knew it because she'd watched it her whole life, and she'd spent her whole life being the instrument of it without ever being acknowledged as the person doing the work, and none of that was resolved or simple. But it wasn't the immediate problem. How did you find me? Marcus, her father's head of security, the refrigerator-shaped man who had driven her to the gala in silence. He's been tracking your location since you left with Vescari. I told him to. A pause. I wasn't sure about Vescari's intentions, but you were sure about Caruso's. He didn't answer that directly, which told her the answer was no, and the answer being no told her that her father had walked into this building not knowing whose side he was prepared to be on, which was either the most honest thing she'd learned about him in years or the most dangerous. Where's Marcus now? She said. Upstairs. He took out 2 of Caruso's men on the east corridor. There are at least 3 more. Gerald paused. And Caruso. She thought about the mesh door, the 12-digit code in her head, the financial architecture she'd built in 40 minutes on a terminal she no longer had access to. Is there a network connection anywhere in this sublevel? Her father blinked. What? A hardwire Ethernet port, a router, anything that connects to the estate's internal network. She was already moving, scanning the walls, the ceiling, the industrial infrastructure of the space. She could see conduit running along the ceiling, electrical, she thought, but there was a second bundle that could be data. If this room is part of the building's original construction, it probably has a network backbone connection. Estates like this were wired for integrated security systems before wireless. Nia, there are men with guns between us and any exit. I know that. She followed the conduit along the ceiling to where it terminated at a junction box on the far wall. She pulled it open. Inside, breakers, a ground connection, and a single Ethernet port that had been installed and never used. The kind of infrastructure that gets built into walls because it's cheaper to do it during construction than retrofit it later. I need something to connect with. A phone, a laptop, anything with a network card. She looked at her father. What do you have? He reached into his jacket and produced his phone. Flagship model, 3 years old, the case cracked on one corner. She held out her hand. He gave it to her without asking what she was doing, which was either trust or resignation, and she didn't have time to determine which. She connected it to the Ethernet port using an adapter she found in the junction box. Installed with the port, never used, still in its original packaging, 12 years old and functioning. And she opened the network configuration manually, bypassing the cellular connection. And she was on the estate's internal network in 90 seconds. The security system came up first because she'd already navigated it, and her access had not yet been revoked. She pulled the camera feeds on Gerald's cracked screen. Small, difficult to read, but functional. She found Caruso in the first-floor corridor, moving toward the stairwell with one man flanking him. She found 2 more men at the estate's front entrance. She found Marcus at the East Corridor junction, positioned behind a structural column, not moving. She found Dominic. He was in the entrance hall. He was standing, which meant he was alive, which meant the Moretti meeting had not gone the way Caruso intended, and she had 1 second of something that was not a calculation. Relief, raw and physical, the kind that lives in the chest, before she moved past it and looked at the screen more carefully. Dominic was in the entrance hall, and he had 2 men with him she recognized from his original security detail. 3 men against however many Caruso had brought, in a building where Caruso knew the layout and Dominic had just arrived. The entrance hall had 3 entry points. Caruso was moving toward the stairwell, which would take him either down to her level or up to the 2nd floor for position. She pulled up the electromagnetic lock system. Every door in the estate was on the integrated security network. Every lock. She'd seen this on day 1 and filed it. She was accessing it now, and she had control of every magnetic lock in the building, which meant she could open and close doors remotely, which meant she could funnel movement, redirect people, turn a 3-entry point entrance hall into a single entry point kill box. And she could do it from an underground room with a cracked cell phone and an Ethernet cable that was 12 years old. "What are you doing?" her father said. "Changing the geometry of the situation upstairs." She was already working, locking the east and north entry points to the entrance hall, leaving only the south corridor open. Caruso was in the west wing. She locked every door between him and the stairwell except one, the one that led through the utility corridor to the south entrance of the hall. She was building a path, not toward escape, toward convergence. "Nia, I need you to call Marcus." She didn't look up from the screen. "Tell him to move north from his current position. Tell him there's a utility corridor behind the east wall access panel." She had seen it on the building schematic and the security system files. Service access routes for maintenance, the skeleton of the building that the visible architecture was built around. "Tell him I'm opening the panel lock remotely in 30 seconds, and he needs to move when I do." Gerald looked at her. Something was happening in his expression that she couldn't catalog right now because she didn't have bandwidth for it. He made the call. She heard him talking to Marcus in a low, clipped voice. Concise. She'd give him that. He was a man who could be concise when the situation demanded. And she hit the lock release on the east wall access panel at 30 seconds exactly and heard from somewhere above her a door open. She called up Dominic's position on the camera feed. He'd moved. He was at the south corridor entrance now, which meant he'd either seen the other entry's lock and understood what it meant, or his instincts had taken him there on their own. Either way, he was where she needed him. She found a building-wide intercom on the security interface. She had not known about this 60 seconds ago. She had it now. She opened it. "South corridor," she said, and her voice came out of every speaker in the estate simultaneously, into every room, into every ear. 30 seconds. Don't stop moving. Then she locked every other remaining door in the building. What happened next, she watched on a cracked screen in a sublevel room in fragments and angles, the way you watch something through a series of windows in quick succession, never the full picture, always assembling it. Dominic moved through the south corridor fast and low. Marcus came through the utility access into the north side of the entrance hall from an angle that put him behind the position Caruso's men had been holding. The geometric advantage was complete and sudden, and the men who had set the trap found themselves inside it. The fight in the entrance hall lasted 4 minutes. She knew this because she timed it, not because she wanted to, but because the part of her brain that couldn't turn off was counting seconds the same way it always counted everything. And she sat in the underground room with the phone in both hands, and she watched the camera feeds with the terrible concentrated attention of someone who understood that the thing happening on the screen was not reducible to tactics and angles and spatial geometry, that it involved men's bodies and pain and the specific permanent weight of irreversible outcomes. And she held all of that and kept watching because looking away was not an option she allowed herself. 4 minutes. Then the entrance hall was still. Then footsteps on the stairs. Fast. Uneven on the third step the way they'd been before, and she was on her feet before they reached the bottom, already at the mesh door. Dominic came through the dark with blood on his right hand and a cut above his left eye that had bled freely and partially clotted, and his breathing was hard, genuinely hard. The breathing of a body that had spent 4 minutes doing something that cost it. He stopped at the mesh door and looked at her, and she looked at him, and neither of them said anything for 1 full second. Then he looked at the lock. "Keys with Caruso," he said. "I know." She already had the security interface back up on the phone. She found the sub-level lock control. Pressed the release. The door swung open. He looked at the phone in her hand, at the Ethernet cable, at the junction box. His face did something that she thought might have been the specific expression of someone revising their understanding of what another person is capable of. "We need to move," he said. "Caruso." "Handled." She looked at him, at the blood on his hand. "Handled how?" "He's alive." A pause. "He'll be explaining himself to a federal task force by morning. I made a call from the car before the Moretti meeting, a contact I have embedded. I knew when you told me about the acceleration pattern that we were past the point where I could manage this internally." He held her gaze. "I just needed to stay alive long enough for the call to matter." Behind her, Gerald Bradford cleared his throat. Dominic looked at him. Gerald looked back. The specific silence of 2 men in a confined space who have been on opposite sides of a calculation and are now recalibrating was something Nia could feel physically, a pressure change like weather. "Mr. Bradford," Dominic said. "Vescari." Her father's voice was careful, not submissive, careful, which from Gerald Bradford was its own kind of significant. "My daughter is leaving this building. Whatever you need to discuss with me can happen after that." "She can speak for herself," Dominic said. Both men looked at her. Nia looked at her father, at the cracked phone in her hand, at the Ethernet cable connecting her to the network she'd just used to redirect a gunfight. She thought about the vault code she still held in her head. 12 digits, $4.2 million plus Viscari reserves, locked in digital space that nobody could reach without her. "There's a conversation we haven't finished," she said to Dominic. "I know. And there's one I haven't started." She looked at her father. With him. Gerald Bradford had the particular stillness of a man who has been waiting for a reckoning for a long time and has finally run out of corridors to walk away down. He looked at his daughter, at Nia, specifically at Nia, not through her, not past her. And she watched him do it and felt the complicated, unresolved weight of 27 years press against the inside of her ribs. "I know," her father said. "Not here." She moved toward the stairs. Not in a basement. They came up into the main floor of the estate, and the entrance hall was the aftermath of what 4 minutes of close-quarters violence looked like. Furniture overturned, 2 of Caruso's men restrained on the floor with zip ties that Marcus had apparently produced from somewhere with the efficiency of a man who planned for this kind of evening. Marcus himself stood near the north wall with the expression that communicated nothing but competence. Caruso sat against the wall with his hands secured behind him and his face arranged into a blankness that Nia recognized as the expression of a man computing his remaining options and not finding many. She stopped in front of him. He looked up at her. "The federal contact," she said to Dominic. "They'll want the financial documentation." "Yes. I'll need to access a secure terminal." She looked back at Caruso. "And I'll need about 2 hours. Everything he moved, everything he built, everything he connected to the Moretti chain. I can give them a map that will take down both organizations simultaneously." She paused. "Or I can make it complicated and slow and expensive and painful for every agency involved. She let that land. I'm telling you what I can do, not what I'll do. What I do depends on how the next hour goes. Caruso said nothing. The 12 digits, she said. You wanted them earlier. I'm going to use them now to begin returning the Viscari reserves to their proper accounts. You're going to watch me do it. I want you to understand concretely what your 14 months of work looks like when someone undoes it in 2 hours. She met his eyes. I want you to carry that. Something moved in Caruso's face. Not shame, exactly. The functional equivalent, the recognition that the architecture you spent 14 months building has been disassembled by a woman who spent 3 days looking at it, and that this fact is now part of the permanent record of your life. Dominic set up a terminal in the East Wing. Nia sat down. Gerald Bradford stood near the doorway with Marcus in the particular posture of a man who is present, and not quite sure what his presence means yet. Dominic stood slightly behind her left shoulder, not watching the screen, watching the room, maintaining the perimeter even now, even exhausted, even with blood drying above his eye, because that was the reflex his life had built. She entered the first 4 digits of the vault code. Her hands were steady. They had been steady all night. She was going to let herself think about that later, when there was a later to think in. But for right now, she kept her attention on the screen and the numbers and the work, because the work was what she had, and what she was, and what had kept her alive and kept the people she'd chosen to protect alive, on a night when the architecture of betrayal had been as sophisticated as anything she'd ever seen. She entered digits 5 through 8. The digital vault responded. The balances appeared. She began to work. 40 minutes in, she found something she hadn't put there. She stopped. Her hands went still above the keyboard. What? Dominic said. He'd been watching the room, but he caught the change in her immediately. The specific cessation of motion that in Nia Bradford meant something significant had just happened. She pointed at the screen. There was a secondary vault. Same architecture as hers, same encryption signature, same construction logic. Built by someone who understood her system at a level that should have been impossible because she had never shared the construction methodology with anyone. It had been built before hers. The timestamp predated her 3 days of work by 4 months. Someone had been inside the Viscari financial network long before Caruso. Someone who built financial vaults the way she built financial vaults. Someone whose architectural fingerprint on the screen was close enough to hers that she'd initially read it as her own reflection. She stared at the screen and her mind went very fast through the implications and arrived at something that she did not want to be true and could not find a way to make untrue. She turned in her chair. She looked at her father. Gerald Bradford looked back at her, and in his face was the thing she'd been seeing since he came down those stairs. Not just fear of losing something, not just the stripped-down version of a man without his performance, but something older and more specific, something she now had a word for. Foreknowledge. Dad. Her voice was very quiet. How long have you known about this network? The room held its breath. Gerald Bradford opened his mouth, and the answer that came out was the one that changed the shape of everything that had happened. Not just tonight, not just 8 months, but years. A number of years that she was not prepared for. And the sound of it in the room was the sound of a foundation giving way beneath a structure that had been built on it by a woman who trusted mathematics more than people because mathematics had never lied to her. And now the mathematics itself was telling her that someone had been in the walls of every system she'd ever built and that someone had her hands. The number her father said was 7. 7 years. Nia sat with that number the way you sit with a physical injury, not processing it immediately, just holding it, waiting for the full shape of the pain to arrive. 7 years ago, she had been 20 years old and her mother had been dead for 1 year, and she had started building the Bradford family's financial architecture because her father had handed her a problem, and she'd solved it, and he'd handed her another one, and she'd solved that too. And the whole time, the whole 7 years, there had been someone else inside the walls she was building. Explain it, she said. Her voice was the temperature of the room. All of it, from the beginning. Gerald Bradford moved away from the doorway. He didn't sit. Men like him didn't sit when they were confessing. Sitting felt too much like surrender, and surrender was a posture his body had never learned. He stood in the middle of the East Wing with his hands at his sides, and he looked at his daughter, and he told her. 7 years ago, before Nia had built anything, before she'd been given access to the family accounts, Gerald Bradford had made a private arrangement with a financial architect he'd been introduced to through a mutual contact in the Chicago underworld, a person who could build untraceable financial structures, a person who had, at that point, already spent a decade building them for various organizations throughout the Midwest and had never once been identified by any federal agency. That person had built the original Bradford offshore architecture, the bones of the system, the foundational structure that Nia had then spent years building on top of, improving, expanding, making into the labyrinth that had kept the family untouchable. She had thought she was building from scratch. She had been building on someone else's foundation without knowing the foundation existed. That person's name was Eleanor Marsh. Nia did not recognize the name immediately. Then she did. Not from the underworld, not from any financial investigation she'd ever run. From a case file she'd read 3 years ago out of professional curiosity. A federal prosecution that had collapsed due to insufficient evidence, involving a financial consultant whose methodology had been described by the prosecuting attorney as the most sophisticated money concealment architecture we have encountered in 20 years of financial crime investigation. The case had been dropped. Eleanor Marsh had walked. And then Eleanor Marsh had disappeared from any public record entirely. She's been monitoring the system, Gerald said. Not interfering. Watching. She built a passive access point into the original architecture before she handed it over. A read-only channel. She's been able to see everything built on top of her foundation this entire time. Nia looked at the screen, at the secondary vault, at the timestamp that predated her own work by 4 months, which meant Eleanor Marsh had not just been watching. 4 months ago, she had done something active. She had built something inside the network that used Nia's own architectural language so precisely that it was nearly indistinguishable from Nia's work. What did she build? Nia said. Insurance, Gerald said. For you. The room was very quiet. What does that mean? Gerald's jaw worked. He looked, for a moment, like a man carrying something he's been carrying so long that the weight has become structural. Remove it, and he might not know how to stand. Eleanor Marsh is your mother's sister, he said, your aunt. She reached out to me 6 months after your mother died. She knew what you were doing for the family. She knew how I was using you. A pause that had years in it. She made me an arrangement. She would maintain passive monitoring access to the system to ensure your work was never compromised from outside. In exchange, she would not take what she knew about our financial architecture to the federal contacts she had from her own past. He met Nia's eyes. She's been protecting you for 7 years without your knowledge. Baba Maposkio. The silence stretched. Dominic, standing behind Nia's left shoulder, said nothing. Marcus, by the wall, said nothing. Even Caruso, restrained on the floor of the entrance hall and visible through the open doorway, seemed to have gone very still. Nia looked at the secondary vault on the screen. She thought about a woman she'd never met, her mother's sister, a financial architect who had spent a decade building invisible structures for invisible people, who had read about her niece building on top of her own foundation and had quietly installed a failsafe without introducing herself, without asking for anything, without being known. She thought about what it meant to protect someone from a distance with no expectation of acknowledgement. She thought about her mother, who had protected her the same way for 19 years and died before Nia understood the full cost of it. Her eyes were dry. She made sure of that, not because she was suppressing anything, but because this was not the moment and she knew herself well enough to know she would find the moment later, alone, and she would be thorough about it, and that would be enough. Where is she now? Nia said. I don't know. She contacts me. Not the other way. Nia looked at the vault architecture on the screen for another moment. Then she turned back to the keyboard and she continued working, because there was still work to do and the work didn't pause for revelation. It took her until 4 a.m. The federal documentation package she built was the most comprehensive financial evidence map she had ever constructed. A complete architecture diagram of the Moretti-Caruso payment chain, every account, every routing path, every shell entity, every false identity, every transaction timestamp, assembled into a format that a federal financial crimes unit could follow without a forensic accountant holding their hand. She built it to be unambiguous. She built it to be irrefutable. She built it the way she built everything, with the understanding that the work had to stand on its own, because she wouldn't always be there to explain it. She also built something else, simultaneously, in a separate encrypted file, A complete map of the Bradford family financial architecture. Every offshore account. Every shell company. Every LLC. Every routing chain she had built over 7 years, including the original foundation she now knew she hadn't built herself. When it was done, she printed both files. She held them. Dominic was watching her from the far end of the room. His cut had been cleaned and closed with butterfly strips from a first aid kit somebody had found. The blood on his hand was someone else's and had dried to brown. He looked tired in the honest, unperformed way of someone who has been awake for 22 hours doing things that cost something. "The federal contact," she said. "What's the arrangement? Information in exchange for operational consideration." He chose the words carefully. "They get documentation on the Moretti organization's interstate operations. In exchange, the Viscari organization gets a window." A pause. A finite one. How finite? Finite enough to make changes that matter. She looked at him. "And the Bradford family." He held her gaze. "That's your decision, not mine." She looked at the 2 files in her hands. The Moretti Caruso documentation, complete and ready. The Bradford architecture map, equally complete, equally ready. She had built both of them in the same 4 hours with the same hands, and they were both true, and they both had consequences, and she was the only person in the room who fully understood what either of them meant. She put the Bradford file on the desk. She picked up the Moretti Caruso file. She looked at her father. Gerald Bradford looked back at her. He had not moved from his position in the center of the room in 4 hours. He had not asked her what she was doing or offered advice or tried to redirect the work. He had stood there and watched his daughter work, and the expression on his face had settled over the 4 hours into something she didn't have a clean category for. Not pride, not quite. Something more like recognition, belated and incomplete. The face of a man seeing clearly something he should have seen a long time ago, and understanding that seeing it now, though late, is not the same as seeing it too late. "The Bradford accounts," she said. "Every offshore chain, every shell company. I'm going to restructure them." She let that sit. Not to protect them, to dissolve them, liquidate them through legitimate channels over the next 18 months. Whatever's recoverable goes to a fund I'm going to establish under independent management, not Bradford-controlled, not connected to any criminal enterprise. She held her father's eyes. "That's not a negotiation." Gerald Bradford was quiet for a long moment. The clock on the wall moved through several seconds. "All right," he said. She had expected more. An argument, a counteroffer, the specific brand of resistance that powerful men deploy when asked to surrender power. What she got was one word, and the word was quiet, and it was real, and she held it and did not know entirely what to do with it. "The Camille situation," Dominic said, not harshly, as a factual item requiring address. Nia had been thinking about Camille since 4 hours ago in an underground room when her sister's voice had come through a phone and told her, without saying it directly, that she had traded information for something she thought was power. She'd been thinking about it the way she thought about all complex problems, not with the goal of arriving at a feeling, but with the goal of arriving at a true thing. Camille had been in contact with Caruso for 8 months. She had passed location information tonight that was intended to keep Nia contained long enough for the plan to complete. She had done this not for money. Camille had never needed money. The Bradford family had money. But for the specific currency that this world actually traded in, the thing her father had given Camille's photograph and not Nia's name: recognition, visibility, the feeling of being chosen. Caruso had offered her a place at the table in whatever the new organization became. He'd offered her what Nia had spent 27 years not being offered, and Camille had taken it, and the fact that the table was built on betrayal and that Caruso had never intended to honor the offer didn't change why she'd said yes. Nia understood the why. She had lived inside the conditions that produced the why. Understanding it didn't resolve it. "The evidence connecting her to the coordination is circumstantial," Nia said. Caruso made the contact. She passed information. A federal prosecutor could build something, but it would be thin. She paused. "I'm not going to supplement it." Dominic looked at her. "She tried to get you killed. She tried to stay relevant in a world that told her relevance was the only thing she had." Nia heard herself say it and recognized that she meant it. "I'm not protecting her. I'm choosing what I spend my energy on. There's a difference." She looked at the Bradford file on the desk. Her financial situation will reflect the restructuring. Everything connected to the family accounts goes. She'll have what she saved independently, which, based on what I know of her spending habits, is not substantial. A pause. She'll have to figure out what she is without the architecture someone else built for her. She said this without irony. The parallel was apparent to everyone in the room, and she left it there. At 6 a.m., 2 vehicles arrived at the estate. Federal agents arriving through the arrangement Dominic had initiated from his car the previous night. Not a dramatic raid, not flashing lights, but the quiet and purposeful arrival of people who had been waiting for documentation that was now ready. Nia handed them the Moretti Caruso file herself. She answered 20 minutes of questions from a woman named Agent Reyes, who had the particular directness of someone who had spent 15 years doing financial crime investigations and had stopped being surprised by human capacity for elaborate dishonesty. Agent Reyes looked at the documentation, looked at Nia, and said, "You built this in 4 hours." "Yes." The Moretti family has had a forensic accountant on retainer for 11 years who couldn't map their own structure as completely as this. Their accountant was mapping from the outside, Nia said. I mapped from the transaction level inward. Agent Reyes looked at her for a moment with the specific expression of someone recalibrating an assessment. "We may need to speak with you further." "I know where to find you," Nia said. Caruso left in federal custody at 6:40 a.m. without looking at Nia as he was walked out. She watched him go from the doorway of the East Wing. He was 61 years old, and he had given 22 years to a family that he had decided at some point hadn't given him enough back, and he had built a 14-month betrayal architecture on that foundation. And it had come apart in 3 days because of a woman he hadn't calculated. And now the rest of his life had a shape that didn't include the things he'd spent 61 years accumulating. She watched him walk to the vehicle, and she felt no satisfaction in it. Satisfaction would have suggested the outcome had been clean, and nothing about the last 12 hours had been clean. Gerald Bradford left at 7. Marcus drove him, the same way Marcus had driven Nia to the gala 4 nights ago, and her father stood at the estate's front entrance before getting in the car and looked at her, and she looked at him, and the distance between them was the same physical distance it had always been, and also the largest distance she had ever measured. "The restructuring," she said. "I'll need full cooperation, access to every account, every entity." "You'll have it," he said, "and I need you to understand that I'm doing this because it's what's right, not because it puts us even. We're not even." He looked at her steadily. "I know." "I don't know what we are," she said. "After this, I don't know what that looks like yet." He nodded. It was a nod that contained, she thought, more than he'd managed to say in 27 years of saying the wrong things or saying nothing. It was not enough. It was something. She was old enough and honest enough to accept that sometimes something and enough were different sizes, and you had to decide whether something was worth the weight of carrying it forward. She decided. She didn't tell him what she'd decided. That could wait for another day, when she had more bandwidth for complexity. He got in the car. It drove away. She stood at the door until it cleared the gate. Then she went inside. Dominic was in the strategy room, which looked different in the early morning light. Less operational, more human. The mess of 4 days of work visible in the arrangement of files and coffee cups, and the chair she'd pushed back from the terminal at 4 a.m. and not returned. He was standing at the window, which faced east, and the light coming through was the thin preliminary light of a morning that hadn't fully committed to itself yet. He turned when she came in. They looked at each other. 4 days ago, she had been in a ballroom in a navy blue dress that was wrong, in the way things are wrong when you've stopped believing you deserve better, and he had walked across a room full of people who couldn't understand why he was walking in her direction. And she had taken his hand because something in her had recognized a moment that mattered, even when she couldn't calculate exactly how. She understood it better now. Not completely. She suspected she would be understanding it in increments for a long time. "The organization," she said. "What's the actual state of it?" "Caruso's network needs to be cut completely. Every connection he built over 22 years gets audited and reassessed." He moved away from the window. "The financial architecture needs to be rebuilt from the ground up. The federal window gives us time, but not indefinite time." He stopped a few feet from her. "I need someone who can do that." "I know. I'm not asking you because I need a financial architect." He said it without preamble, which she appreciated. Preamble was what people used when they weren't sure of the thing they were trying to say. He was sure. I'm asking you because you spent 3 days in my network and 4 hours building federal documentation and an entire night in a basement with a cracked phone and an Ethernet cable. And at no point did you do anything other than exactly what you said you would do. He paused. That's not common. No, she said. It's not. I want to build something different than what my father built. His voice was careful but not rehearsed. Smaller, maybe. Cleaner. The federal window is an opportunity to restructure in ways that... He stopped. I'm describing a business proposition. Yes. That's not the only thing I'm describing. I know that too. She looked at him in the morning light, this man with the twice-broken nose and the healing cut above his eye and the hands that had done things she understood in the abstract and didn't fully want to examine in the particular. And she thought about what it meant to choose a direction when you couldn't fully see where it ended. She'd spent her whole life calculating outcomes before she moved. She'd built systems and models and contingencies because certainty was the only thing that made the risk acceptable. She didn't have certainty here. She had evidence of character, which was different and in some ways more reliable, and she had the specific knowledge that 4 nights ago she had taken a hand extended across a room full of people who expected something else. And the consequences of that single choice had included being locked in a basement and losing 7 years of assumptions about her own work and finding a vault built by an aunt she'd never met who had been protecting her from a distance for 7 years. And none of it had been predictable, and none of it had been safe, and she was standing here anyway, which told her something about herself that she was still in the process of understanding. I need an office, she said, separate from this room, somewhere with better lighting. Something shifted in his face. Not quite a smile, the architecture of one. Done. And I'm going to need to reach out to a woman named Eleanor Marsh. He nodded, asking no questions about who that was, which was either trust or the wisdom to know that some things would be explained in their own time. And I want full transparency, she said. Not just the accounts I'm given access to, all of them, everything. If I'm building this, I build it the way I build things, or I don't build it. All of it, he said, all of it. She nodded. She picked up the Bradford architecture file from the desk where she'd left it, and she held it for a moment. 7 years of her own work. The foundation she hadn't built, and the 14 floors she had built on top of it. All of it mapped, all of it documented, all of it ready to be dissolved in an 18-month process that would be meticulous and legally unassailable, and would permanently close a door she had been walking through her entire adult life. She set the file in her bag. She would carry it out. She would carry it all the way through to the end, because that was who she was and how she worked, and she would not hand it to someone else or outsource it or do it halfway. And when it was done, there would be nothing left of the structure she'd spent 7 years building for a man who had hidden her from the rooms where her own work was discussed. That was not grief, exactly. It was the weight of a true accounting. Balanced. Final. She picked up her bag. I need to sleep, she said. 8 hours. Somewhere quiet. East Wing has a guest room. I know. I found it on day 2. She moved toward the door, then stopped. She had spent 4 days in this building not knowing whether to trust it, and she was leaving it with a set of decisions she hadn't walked in with, and the texture of that was specific and not simple. Dominic. He looked at her. The gala, she said. That night. Walking across the room. She held his eyes. Was that calculated? He was quiet for 3 full seconds. I saw someone doing math in a ballroom while everyone around her was performing, he said. And I thought, that's the most interesting person in this room, and I want to know what she's calculating. A pause. So yes and no, both. She considered this. It was the right kind of answer. Not a performance, not a flattery, just a true thing stated accurately, which was a rarer quality than it should have been. Okay, she said. She walked out of the strategy room and down the corridor toward the east wing, and the morning light followed her through the windows on the left side of the hall, pale and specific. The light of a city that had moved through a night without knowing what it contained, and was now arriving at a day that would look, from the outside, like any other day. The room was the same as she'd left it 4 days ago. The cot was narrow and institutional, and the blanket was thin, and she sat on the edge of it and removed her shoes and set them side by side on the floor with the precision of someone who maintains order in the small things, because the large things are frequently beyond control. She lay down. She looked at the ceiling. She thought about her mother, not with the sharp, specific ache that used to accompany the thought, but with something quieter, the warmth of something that doesn't leave even when the person does. She thought about Eleanor Marsh, who had watched her for 7 years from inside the walls she was building and had installed a safety net she'd never used. She thought about what it might mean to meet a person who had protected you before you knew you needed protecting. She thought about the gala 4 nights ago, which was the last time the world had made sense in the particular limited way it had made sense before. The navy blue dress, her sister's voice, the 11 steps she'd taken toward the exit before she stopped. The hand extended across a room of people who couldn't understand what they were witnessing. She thought about what Dominic had said, the most interesting person in this room, and she thought about her mother's voice years ago saying, "Nia, the world will try to make you small, and your job is simply to refuse." And she thought about the fact that she had not changed her dress, or her body, or the particular way she occupied a room, and the room had changed around her anyway, which was not what she'd been taught to expect, and which she was still, at the end of this night, in the early process of believing. She closed her eyes. Outside, Chicago was beginning its day in the ordinary, relentless way of cities that have survived too much to be impressed by any particular night. Traffic on roads that didn't know what had moved through them. People making coffee and checking phones and stepping into the morning without any awareness of the specific geometry of betrayal and mathematics and stubborn survival that had resolved itself, quietly, in a limestone estate north of the city while they slept. The world didn't know. It almost never did. That was Nia Bradford understood precisely the point. She had never needed the world to know. She had only ever needed to know herself. And she did. Better now than 4 days ago. Better than 7 years ago. Better than she had on any morning that had come before this one. She knew what she could do and what she was willing to do, and what she would never do, and what she would carry forward, and what she had chosen. Finally, after 27 years of being the most important person in rooms where she was treated as the least important person, to put down. She was not the woman they expected. She had never been. She breathed, she slept. And somewhere in the walls of a financial network that now answered to her, not to her father, not to a man who had spent 14 months building a betrayal, not to a family that had used her genius as furniture. An encrypted vault held a number she had memorized, and the number was a door, and the door was hers, and she was the only one who could open it. That was enough. That was everything.